Hello, fellow geekologists. Welcome to another episode of Systematic Geekology. And what you're about to hear is a panel from the Geek Stage at Theology Beer Camp 2024 in Denver, Colorado. Joshua and I had such a great time at last year's Theology Beer Camp, connecting with friends, even podcasting with some of our heroes in the podcast game. What Trip Fuller does with Theology Beer Camp really does align with our mission and vision at Systematic Geekology. That is, in creating and curating safe and brave spaces to explore the big questions around what we all geek out on. And so thank you, Trip, for creating that space for us to have a Geek Stage and to have really deep and rich conversations around philosophical and theological and geeky things. And so we hope that all of you listening to this will join with us in this conversation, either in our socials or reaching out to us, and perhaps even attending a Theology Beer Camp and seeing us in person. Stay tuned for when and where Theology Beer Camp 2025 will be. And so we hope to see you there. Come out and geek out with us, and we hope that you will join in these conversations with us. Peace, friends.
You're listening to an Anazal Ministries podcast.
Normally on the show, we attempt to keep things as child-friendly as possible, but every now and then we can hit some harder subject matters or may even have some verbal discourses that may not be suitable for younger or more sensitive ears to hear. In this episode, there may be either a discussion on more mature topics or may have strong language, or perhaps both at once. Your discretion is advised.
We're here to talk about D&D, the process of an adventure. So a couple things. How many of you all play D&D? There we go.
Wow, okay.
I like it. A lot of hands out there. How many of you have never played, but you're interested and D&D curious? Handful,
right,
a couple. Two people here.
Right.
How many of you are like super into like process, philosophy, and theology, and really want to know that D&D is very process, and that's why you're here, because you like the intersection of all of them.
All right, so we're mostly here for D&D.
That's
cool.
right. They're mostly here for D&D. So the other day for our pregame event, we played a D&D Tolkien-esque. It was in the Tolkien world. It was in Middle Earth. Not Middle Earth. It was in Middle Earth. I almost said Midgard because I saw my Thor friend here. Middle Earth. And so these are some of the quotes. Just a few quotes from that game. The dice giveth and the dice taketh away. After my friend rolled a nat 1 a few times, screams out, "This game is for nerds." And then there was an existential question of, does an orc have a heart? Does an orc have a heart? And then, damn it, that was my 5th crit fail. I think that was Ryan.
That's some mean dice in that game.
And then someone had to get up and use the restroom while we were playing, and he quoted, this is a full-on quote, "While this is happening, Gimli heads off to water some mushrooms." I have a question about his dark gift. Yep. And I can't read my own writing. Oh, I think this was you, Eric, right? You said, it wasn't an attack. I was just perceiving with my arrow. All-time favorite quote. That was so good. So yeah.
Fire a perception
very
shot.
Good. Perception check, exactly. So, Father Joe Bracken asked the question, does God roll dice? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure, but we do, and that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to go down and just kind of introduce ourselves and do a quick, 2-minute, if that, origin story of what got us into D&D or our connection to D&D. And I'll just start real fast. As a kid of the 80s, I loved D&D, but I just never played it. I just liked the manuals and the monster handbook. And I just love looking at the pictures and reading the profiles. I'm a comic book geek and love the Marvel character profiles and Marvel handbooks and all those things. So I just kind of read D&D books to look at the cool art and fantasy world. As of late, being a part of Systematic Geekology and other geek friends have played a few times. I'm a real big novice when it comes to actual playing, but it's super fun and I love it and I'm hooked and can't wait to have this conversation. Samantha.
Cool. Hello, everybody. I'm Samantha Perez. I have been on one episode of Systematic Geekology. I've been on I've dabbled around the God Pod scene here. If you listen to the bonus episodes of You Have Permission and Homebrewed, I've been on at least one of those. Yeah. But so my D&D history, it's relatively recent, more recent than people expect when they find out about my nerd history, that D&D entered relatively recently in my fandom pantheon. I've been playing for, it was about 10 years. It was when I moved to DC from Texas and was starting to meet new people. And I met a group of people that played, and I knew what it was. But just growing up in the, Bible Belt, Texas area I was from, it was not something that people I was friends with played. I played a couple of the computer games, so I knew what it was. But it was about 10 years ago that a friend introduced me to it, and I played my first campaign. We played Pathfinder to begin, which is kind of a D&D offshoot, because some nerds were not happy with how D&D was going, so they made their own D&D with blackjack and hookers.
Nerds not happy? What?
And so that was my introduction, and that's still what I played the most. But that was about 10 years ago, and I got hooked on it from there, and I have been I've been in a campaign basically ever since, especially when COVID happened and we were in quarantine. I reconnected with a bunch of friends back home and started a couple of online campaigns of stuff. And so it's been a really important part of staying connected with people that I grew up with. And now I played a bunch. I taught beginners D&D at a library last summer and played games for new people. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a really cool exercise in storytelling and meaning making, and just a neat community feature. So I'm excited.
Amen. And Tom, real fast, systematic ecology, when I think Beer Camp does well, and a lot of the talks here, there's a lot of you have permission talk of we love Dan Koch, but also in terms of you have permission be faith and science. You have permission to be a geek and a Christian, a person of faith, that they come together. So often the questions that arise out of these fandoms, Star Wars, Tolkien, Alien franchise, video games, and this, are deep existential questions that we wrestle with within our faith communities as well. So that's what we've discovered, and what we try to do is have a healthy conversation around these things. And they're susceptible to toxic fandom as well as the church and other things too. But trying to have healthy conversations, and all of this is to say, yeah, we know the history behind the religious community's reaction to fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons, but this is a space where look, this is where we can incorporate this. And Tom has a fantastic story of how his dad incorporated it, both yet person of faith community and fantasy Dungeons and Dragons. Tom, introduce yourself, your background, who you are, and run with your paper, my friend.
Thank you. I'm Tom Herman-Webster. I'm an acquiring editor for academic theology and ethics at Orbis Books. You may have seen me up at the table upstairs. I also teach Methodist studies at Memphis Theological Seminary. I have a PhD in process eco-sacramental liberation theology from Boston University, and I am a Methodist pastor from the North Alabama Conference, though I live in New York because that's where the publishing house is. My answer to the intro, how did you get into D&D, is a long paper. So here we go. In 1984, Melanie Smith wrote an article for the Decatur Daily newspaper in Decatur, Alabama, titled "Minister Gives Game Religious Tone." She wrote, "Battling evil in a fantasy world may help young people learn to stand up to evil in the real world, believes a local minister." Smith contrasted the minister and his fellow Dungeons and Dragons adventurers with, quote, "some Christian groups who had condemned the game for its free references to magic, wizardry, violence, and occultism," close quote. Such condemnations characterized the so-called satanic panic of the 1980s, you may remember that, and its conservative Christian undercurrents. And though it is 40 years ago, that era is still very politically consequential today. Aware of this broader satanic panic context, that minister told Smith, "In this country, we tend to think of spirituality as going to church and praying if things get real bad. Playing D&D teaches students that spirituality is more than going to church on Sunday. Spirituality is a mental attitude or a way of living in the world that shapes the whole of life. 40 years later, I think we should approach the minister in that newspaper article with a serious care as a conversation partner for constructive theology, for spiritual formation, for theological education, for pastoral care, for people of all ages. And I'm kind of lucky because, as Will mentioned, I actually can approach that minister as a serious conversation partner because he's my dad. As D&D adventuring theologians, I think we can recognize many ethical and cosmological questions that bubble up in role-playing games. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, are the cosmological and ethical questions and how we're spiritually formed when we play role-playing games. More than merely conveying and storing information, role-playing encourages us to cultivate relationships that undergird the social critiques, solidarity, and self-determination that are necessary for us if we are able to bring about an abundant life of justice and love throughout all of creation. Theological reflection on D&D might feel weird because, like, it's not the Bible or Jesus isn't there or something, but I think it's necessary because it can encourage abundant living in God's own adventure when we theologically think about the adventures we go on. And when we recognize God's adventure of zest, beauty, love, and peace with us, to use Whitehead language. I want us to think about theological education today in a broader way than a lot of Protestants and Catholics have talked about it in recent decades. Justo Gonzalez is a brilliant thinker, and he has argued that theological education today must return to its proper place, which is at the heart of the church. It must turn into a lifelong process and develop in such a way that helps the entire church face constantly evolving circumstances and unexpected challenges. And I think we should approach Dungeons and Dragons in the spirit of Gonzalez's claim that theological inquiry is not just for interesting pastimes of curious people. Rather, theological inquiry is an act of devotion and obedience to God, to love God with all of your heart and mind. Role-playing games can give us a vision of decoupling theological education from academic requirements for a degree. Theological education, D&D teaches us, are more inclusive and dynamic processes of how we relate to ourselves, to each other, to our broader community, and to God. So, my dad's story. He learned to play D&D when he was in seminary at Perkins at SMU in Dallas, Texas in the late 70s. After graduating from Perkins, he was appointed to pastor a small church outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and there was a small youth group at the church with only like 10 kids. When they learned that my dad had played D&D before, keep in mind D&D is like 7 years old at this point, right? 8 years old at this point. When the kids learned that my dad had played in seminary, several of them were like, hey, we want to play too. How though? And so they set up a time the following week to learn the game and for my dad to try to figure out how to be a dungeon master. And they then played at least once a month for the next 3 years. It became youth group. Yeah. It became a regular act of the church. And my dad remembers that the adventures felt really bad at first. If you've ever been, how many of you have ever DM'd? Brave souls. I've tried it once. I'm terrible at it. If you've ever been an early DM, so think about some of your earliest games, you may recognize these feelings. There was no way he had taken everything into account. He had not anticipated at all how creative the players could be in their conversation and their work and action with each other. And he felt totally inadequate because he felt out of control, right? How familiar is that, DMs? These early experiences of learning to play as a DM, I think, demonstrate the necessity for us as people of faith, for educators, for pastors, for spiritual mentors, to teach from curiosity or hope or empathy or honesty instead of from a desire for control. When we teach from curiosity or hope or empathy or honesty, we actually don't fear the lack of control. We don't fear our failure to anticipate the possible events that occur in our relationships as learners and as disciples. My dad's own anxieties impacted the gameplay at the table. It also impacted his own perceptions of the players around the table, right? They became a competition against him, right? As spiritual mentors, as disciples on a path together, as pastors, as teachers, we can be really tempted to mightily hold on to the profound gifts that we've received so tightly out of a fear that we're going to mess something up, that we actually risk distorting the very relationships that can bring abundant life, that can bring creative hope, and that can bring transforming love in our communities. Loosening our grip, DMs, loosening our grip is far easier said than done.
An uncontrolling love of God.
There's an uncontrolling love of God, to quote Tom Ward.
But I wrote 3 pages about the people in the back room of this tavern, and they didn't want to go in the back room.
They didn't want to go in the back room of the tavern. However, take heart in the original texts. Gary Gygax wrote, "Advanced D&D is more than a framework around which individual DMs construct their respective milieu. Advanced D&D is above all a set of boundaries for all of the worlds devised by referees everywhere." That's in Advanced D&D Dungeon Master's Guide. Gygax contrasts these boundaries to the rules and movements and sequence that govern a game like chess. These boundaries, Gygax writes, are broad and spacious, and there are numerous areas where they are so vague and amorphous as to make them nearly non-existent. But they are there nonetheless, close quote. As a process theologian, this sends up every light bulb. Because like our own world, real limitations exist in D&D, and they're cosmological limitations in which we as players can be creative and make consequential decisions. When we actually have these real limitations, we can creatively decide and act in ways that are significant for our spiritual and ethical formation because those decisions have consequences. Role-playing games blur the distinctions that we've created between theory and practice. Role-playing games break down the body-mind dualism that has driven Western thought, because role-playing games privilege aesthetic, manual, emotional learning and knowing instead of rational, abstract discourse. Even in a fairy world, you still are trying to perceive with your arrow. It's completely made up, except that you are dead serious in that moment. And the reason you're dead serious is because if you actually are trying to shoot with that arrow, there are going to be consequences for somebody on your team. Like in the game, things might not go as initially planned in our lives. Within the game, players have to rely on adapting and improving to resolve a situation where the effect of their actions and other participants' actions are, for the most part, out of their hands. How much of a D&D game are you, player, actually acting? And how much are you sitting there listening to, taking in, accounting for all of the people at the table with you? Role-playing games foster a personal openness to possibility. They also foster a more fundamental recognition that possibility is precisely that. It's possible. No future event is ever set down in stone in the game. It's only possible until one of your comrades or you actually roll the nat 20. When I was 13, so I've been playing D&D for like 23 years now. When I was 13, we were coming around a bend on a mountain path, and I loved to play half-elf rangers. And we're coming around a bend on a mountain path, and my dad just says, roll for initiative. He doesn't give any context. He does this a lot. It's a problem. And so we roll for initiative, and my brother and I and our friend who we were playing with, all poor rolls. So a purple worm comes up out of the ground real fast and had like a 19 on the initiative. Purple worm very much clearly in charge of the scenario. And
as they tend to be.
Yes, they tend to be. What you need to know is earlier in this campaign, I had attempted to lasso a brown dragon.
As one does.
As one does. And I rolled a 19.
Certainly try.
And the crowd's like, oh no.
Yeah. And I rolled a 19. And my dad, not happy that the half-elf 13-year-old had just rolled a 19 to lasso a brown dragon, was like, here we go. Purple worm for the kill. Purple worm misses on attack. My brother, who was running a thief, gets away. He was really good at running away. He who fights and runs away lives to fight another day, right? And I was not. And so I pull out my bow and I fire. And my dad says, okay, roll. It's only possible in that moment, right? As the dice comes out of the hand. Nat 20. And we played advanced D&D. This is like 2003, right? My dad is still using advanced D&D in 2024, right? 5e does not exist to my father. In advanced D&D, a nat 20 does what? Kill. Dead. That's not an automatic hit. That's not bonuses. You're a level 2 ranger, and you just ended the entire encounter with the purple worm in one shot. Right? Aside from inflating ego. When the future itself is overflowing with possibilities, but no possible event in our future is fixed, we actually have to act in ways that instantiate hope for particular outcomes, right? Hope is never a thing that we have or own. You understand this, right? Like none of us have hope. Hope is not a substance. If it was, substances aren't real. Welcome to process thought. Hope is something we enact. Hope is something that because the future is only possible, because the future is radically open, hope is something that we identify among the possibilities with the lure of God, and we say that, God, let's go. And we move. We make choices now that have consequences to move us toward the better world that's possible. D&D teaches on a real basic level that every future event is only possible. And this is baked into the cosmology the way that Gygax writes it. But when everything is only possible, and then I want to open this back up to all of us, that unfixedness can be a tremendous source of anxiety. Incorporating this anxiety and unfixedness into the cosmology, D&D fosters opportunities for us to encounter the real impact of our choices and other people's choices that they make in the dynamic game world. For my dad, being a DM and a pastor interweaves to this day. His pastoral care professor regularly repeated the phrase that pastors are to be non-anxious presences. DMs, how many times have you had to be the non-anxious presence at the table? Not because you knew that it was going to be all right? But because you knew in that moment the anxiety toward the unfixedness of the future was not good for the well-being of your players. as people of faith in confronting a radically open future, as people of faith for whom there's not a set thing ahead of us, we can descend into an anxiety that really is debilitating. But none of us can adventure alone. And so when we're adventuring as people of faith, we have responsibilities to be non-anxious presences with one another, not ignoring the anxiety, but identifying that you can be a sacramentally life-giving, hope-filled presence for someone else. You can actually mediate the presence of God, who calls forth love and peaceableness and adventure in the face of anxiety. For God journeys with us. The future is radically unfixed even for God in process thought, right? So when God is journeying with us, calling forth the love and the peace and the beauty in the face of our anxiety, we have a non-anxious presence that we can reveal and mediate with one another. This is the beauty of playing, I think. This is a framework that Dungeons and Dragons, I think, can challenge us to practice in our own spiritual lives with each other. The good DM, like the good teacher, like the good pastor, frames their work through nurture. The good DM's job is to nurture the relationships at the table so that the relationships around the table can be life-giving. Play clears space then. Play nurtures us because it clears space to think new thoughts, to engage new practices, to develop new forms of expression, and to practice new ways of being than we have been in the past. Play is for us an imaginative engagement in an otherwise unimaginative world. It's often multisensory, incorporating miniature figurines, ambient sounds. I've even been around costumed DMs or DMs that have themed menus for the adventure.
I love the themed food. I do that.
The themed food it's incredible. We can, as it were, because of our play, we can try on values and activities that amplify, introduce, or transform our own lives beyond the game. This is, I think, really important when we think about inclusive gameplay, and I want to talk about that. This is really important when we think about inclusive gameplay. This is really important when we think about outside of the game, when we think about journeying together and who journeys with us and how do we protect ourselves, but how do we also be caring and open toward other journeyers, adventurers. I don't want to leave us on the cliffhanger, though, of a random newspaper article in Decatur, Alabama. It's a short but interesting article. Dad got a little blowback from it. He was an associate pastor at a big steeple church in town. The senior pastor got more of the blowback than the associate pastor who hung out with the youth got. Isn't that how that always goes? So my dad forgot about the article, and he continued to play at the church. This is a second church now. He continued to play at the church with a group of students. A couple of months after that article was published, the church secretary buzzed his office to let him know that he had a phone call. And he said, okay, who's it from? He said, Gary something? So my dad picked up the phone, and a man on the other end said, hi, Reverend Webster. This is Gary Gygax. Instead of a cease and desist order that would aim squarely at the many changes that he and his players made to the cosmology and the ethical construction of the game, which we can also talk about, Gygax actually wanted to talk about how they were playing. He thought it was one of the coolest things he'd ever heard. He was excited about the variations. He told my dad several times about how the rules of the game are meant to be malleable and broad enough to allow for unique expressions of gameplay. And I think for us, 40 years later, as models of theological education and spiritual formation undergo tremendous change, Role-playing games like D&D, because of that malleability, because of that broadness, because of that inclusive and encouraging gameplay, they will continue to cultivate creativity, nurture life, and inspire imagination for the life of the world. So, people of faith, people of spirit, tend to dungeons, for you can find vibrant allies there. Players, DMs, embrace your responsibility to explore profound depths of meaning in your game world, for our world will journey with you. And with that, adventure on.
Nice work.
All right. All right. Thank you so much. That's so cool. So I don't know if you were at all of the sessions that have been going on at Beer Camp so far, but this brought to mind Ilia Delio's session that she did yesterday. And I was struck when she mentioned, even in pre-human mammals, she identified playing as a form of proto-religion. Mm-hmm. She said entities have always played as a way to temporarily invite each other into a different, inclusive, low-stakes space where we can figure out who we are.
Yeah, man.
And I was texting our group chat instantly. I said, we should get Delio to play Dungeons and Dragons. And we started a conversation about what class she would be, and it was very fun. But I'm curious, as
Artificer.
My argument was that she's a sorcerer, but her patron is like the quantum omni being underneath our
that would
dimension.
work too. Yeah, that would definitely.
Yes. But so I'm curious how you respond to this, and just as you think of that concept of play as a space where we invite each other to make meaning, how does role playing, how would you, I guess, compare and contrast that to saying playing like we're just wrestling, or we're playing hopscotch, or we're playing basketball, or we're playing Call of Duty? Like what does this form of play have kind of better or worse than other forms of play for this sort of religious meaning making that she identified?
Oh, good question. Competition. Mm-hmm. So I played baseball for 16 years. Mm-hmm. I played a lot. And I love the game, and I still love to play. And I was a college ultimate frisbee player, and all of those playing forms had a single goal, had a closed system, if you will, right? There was a closedness to the game that with referees that one of us was going to win, one of us was going to lose. Or even if you're playing soccer and you end in a tie, there's a struggle for supremacy. I think the difference in role play gaming play is the open cosmology that the open cosmology. Any teachers in the room? So there's a form of pedagogy called gamification pedagogy, where you turn lots of things into games in the classroom. And a really simple example of this closed kind of play or open play. Closed play would be like CPR practice. Mm-hmm. Right, like I'm playing
winners and losers.
Right, right. Like I'm playing.
It won't be me either way. But.
I love that.
I'm playing on this mannequin, right? And the CPR is a role play. Like I'm role playing as the lifesaver, but really it's not. There are no consequences. Mm-hmm. Like it's a plastic mannequin with a little bladder inside, right? But for this kind of like open cosmology, non-competitive play, there actually are a lot of consequences here. And there are consequences in the game world, but there are also consequences at the table. Like if I'm constantly trying to undermine every action Will takes in the game world, not only is that going to have an outcome in the game, it could actually really redefine our relationship to each other outside of the game. And the play that we get, I think, in in a lot of other forms of play, because it is closed toward one single particular goal, it doesn't have that kind of formative aspect to it.
Can I follow up?
Absolutely.
So one thing that I think about, because I've played a lot of D&D. I branched out. I go to like a meetup that plays indie RPGs. We play a bunch of stuff. In your theory of role playing as pedagogy, of role playing as theological education, you have kind of a baked in assumption of a game master as the primary teacher. There's a pedagogy centered on the dungeon master who is teaching and nurturing the players. There are other systems. I think of things like of stuff like Powered by the Apocalypse type games, where there is still a game master, but there is systems for the players to interact with the universe itself way more directly than Dungeons and Dragons have. And then I think of stuff like, Fiasco or Microscope, where there is no dungeon master. Everybody is collectively creating this story and refereeing together. How does that change? How does this interact with your idea of role playing? And do you think that makes it a better or worse or different kind of mapping onto the theological education that you're talking about with role playing?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So one of the reasons why I'm so DM centric, of course, is this paper comes out of a chapter that my dad and I wrote together for a book that's coming out in December on theology, religions, and Dungeons and Dragons in honor of the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons. And so we were very D&D focused and really wanted to do some autoethnography reflection for my dad on being a DM. That said, I think it actually translates to the other games pretty flawlessly, because the DM in their best work is not actually different from the players. The DM is a part of the co-creative relationships at the table, and there are other game mechanics and other game structures that just lean into that co-creativity more. And but what is key is they maintain the cosmological openness, right? They maintain the possibility of the future. They maintain the consequential action in the present. And so I think the reliance on DMs in this is D&D specific. Yeah. But I don't think it loses in translation to other games. Yeah. It's a great question.
I love your paper, and as a pastor entrusted with taking care of a community, shepherding community, what intrigues me with it, of course, I resonate with the non-anxious presence, and when I'm flying, I'm keeping my eye on the flight attendant. If they're freaking out, I'm going to freak out. But if they're cool during this turbulence, I'm going to be cool too. But the words that I associate with D&D, what I've really been kind of resonating with and collecting or thinking through with Beer Camp, is this idea of play, of improv, of collaborative storytelling, imagination. Us telling a story, theater of the mind, of us telling a story together, and you don't know what's going to happen. The DM may know some things, but yeah, like you said, it's an open-ended story that could go in different directions, different timelines, alternate time, multiverse, whatever. But there's these possibilities, and so I really resonate with the story of your dad getting a call from Gary, which is a freaking cool story. But I can imagine getting a call from my bishop, who's like, "Will, we need to talk," and I'm like, what did I do wrong? We had Theology Beer Camp, or we're talking faith and science, or you're doing this God Loves Geeks Club. What I need to know, but instead of shutting me down, cease and desist, but open, tell me more. Yeah. What is happening? What new life is emerging? How is this helping you? I give you permission to keep going with this, because who knows what could happen and what the Spirit could do in these things. So, and I guess it's not more of a question of more of thing, but in terms of this idea of collaborative storytelling, partnering on the journey, the process together. You wrote your paper on faith formation, teaching Sunday school or youth groups, but also theological education in the seminary. But what if we did more collaborative improv, story play? how would the church be different? How would our communities we take care of and relationships that we're entrusted with, how would they be different moving forward in the spirit of Theology Beer Camp and what that looks like for future church?
Yeah. Oh, that's a tremendous question. There are 5 different ways I want to go, but I'm only going to pick 2. So one is I think one of the things that's really cool about D&D and role-playing gaming and improv is that we realize that storytelling is also play. Mm-hmm. That it's not that we play over here in a story. Then
that's what we forget about Scripture.
Right, exactly.
Playing with Scripture.
Then we go have story time. Mm-hmm. Then we go play in a story. And I think that's the first direction I would go, is that it can help us re-encounter the Bible as a library of stories, not a book, right? The Bible is not a book. It's a library of books. And it's a library of books that communicate stories and invite us into stories that are not our own. I mean, what other definition of grace do you need? That it invites us into stories that are not our own and gives meaning. So I think it can change our relationship to Scripture. Instead of being this cudgel and this top-down book, Warhammer, fixed, unfixed. Is it an open canon, a closed canon? Is it useful in every decision you make in life, or the authoritative? That's actually not the question, right? I think the question is, how do we play well with the story? Amen. And how do we play well with one another through the story? So that's the first direction I would go. The second direction I would go, and this is for those of us who are in more mainline traditions or Catholic traditions, it breaks down a clericalism that divides the ordained from the laity in what has needed to happen for a long time.
Clerichood of all believers? Is that what you just said?
No, actually. Still Methodist enough that I'm not going that far.
You can't all play clerics. That's not balanced.
We can't all play clerics. But what it actually does, and process theology helps us with this, what it actually does is it takes us out of thinking that the difference between a cleric and a layperson is a difference between the substance cleric and the substance lay. Instead, we are all journeying as a body together, and there are functions that we all are called to and gifted to fill. And there are functions that we live into, and ordained ministry then is not ordained to a status above laity. It is ordained to a function within the laity.
Almost like a body with different
Almost
parts.
like a body.
And anyway, I was going to make some analogy about the hand to the foot and the foot to the head. Yeah. But I think, body of Christ.
I think when we play like this, we actually do realize that, look, Paul might have gotten that one right.
Oh,
and not only might Paul have gotten that one right, he might have gotten that one right because he's leaning into something we all recognize very well, and that's the organicness of our bodiedness. Our bodies matter, and we recognize that our bodies matter in the church because of how we function in relationship with each other, not because of how we're statically lifted above or pushed below others.
I want Samantha to follow up, but also we are in a moment going to take some questions. If you want to share a thought, question, want to engage with that, Kim over here has a mic, and you can walk over here and share, because it's just not long enough to take out to everybody. So if you have a question, thought, those kind of things.
I'll do one more while people think of questions.
Go for it.
And I think we foreshadowed this a little bit, but I want to dig into it. We mentioned at the beginning, and I mentioned in my intro, and you mentioned at the beginning of the paper, because if you're in religious spaces, you've heard of Dungeons and Dragons at some point in the context of a thing we were once real scared of. I remember I bought the computer game Neverwinter Nights, and my mom noticed the Dungeons and Dragons logo on the back, and she's like, "Is this okay?" And I had to make up a defense for why I should be able to play Neverwinter Nights. So I guess my question to you is, as you've thought through this, as you've played it, at face value, the church's opposition to Dungeons and Dragons historically was there's wizards and there's devils, and that's evil. Yeah. Do you take that opposition at face value, or if you don't, what do you think the institutional church was actually scared of when people were getting into Dungeons and Dragons?
I love that question so much. What were they scared of?
I've got a quote.
Ooh, all right.
In 1984, Jack Chick, those of you who may have been around in the D&D world in 84 may remember that Jack Chick wrote a tract that claimed that Dungeons and Dragons led to suicide and goddess worship. That's what they were afraid of.
The women.
But I want to make a clarification. It wasn't the institutional church in the sense of mainline American Protestantism. The way that the Satanic Panic, and I'm not a scholar on the Satanic Panic, though that doesn't stop most of us from saying things. The way that the religious right and the moral majority effectively used an other to gain credence with parents was, we're trying to protect your kids from thinking that death is an okay option in the face of
adventure,
stress and the world, and being a suburban mall rat teen in 1986, right? And they, by claiming that they were actually looking out for the safety of the children.
Aren't they always?
Yeah. By claiming they're looking out for the safety of the children, they're able to gain a particular kind of foothold that is extremely low stakes if they're wrong. Because if they're wrong, they just go to another one. Right. And so this is, I think, one of the things that my dad encountered with this article, and why the article was written the way it was my dad was the pastor, the associate pastor at a United Methodist Church in Decatur, Alabama, which is a town at the time run by the Church of Christ. Right. Yeah. And we're talking like the no instrument Church of Christ. And so that dichotomy, it wasn't just that it was a minister who was playing this game with the kids. It was a Methodist minister. It was a mainline minister. A youth minister. Yeah. It was a mainline denomination minister, right? And so I think there's a really important divide there to make between like an institutional mainline American church and the way that the moral majority really did try to protect the kids' language.
Quick follow up, and just as like a pastor of a church and things that most of the times I see, and with our work with Faith and Science or Faith and Geek stuff, most of the time when churches react, what are they scared of? The loss of influence and power. Yes. So if they see something that's more popular than me or getting more attention than me, I'm going to get defensive and look, we got to tear that down. So same way, like I'm going to lose funding, I'm going to lose power and influence. And so is that the way of Christ? No. So like to think through deeply, what am I really scared of is the question that we should ask whenever we have like a defensive response to anything that we're going on. Yeah. So like that's, I resonate with that a lot. Cool. Questions. Let's go for it.
Hi. So I guess my question is, I've been in role-playing game spaces for a little while at this point. A big thing that comes up about D&D in particular, at least when it comes to questions of like inclusion and progressiveness, is that it's a game that kind of wants you to encourage sort of a pseudo-colonialist approach to adventure, i.e., raiding tombs of people that belong to you, et cetera, et cetera. So I was just kind of curious about, like, what does a play group build on in that kind of situation or with this text, or if it's better to kind of work their way around it? I guess that's kind of the question I'm coming from. That's
a fantastic question. Love it, James. And Dungeons and Dragons in particular, as some of you who've played earlier editions may remember, Gygax and the other editors were really committed to biological essentialism. And really committed to racial essentialism, that there were particular traits that particular races had, right?
Like
that
being
were
evil or not.
well, being evil or not, or even advantage, disadvantage, right? Like elves and dwarves. What do they have in common that humans can't do? See in the dark, right? But the norm was always the human, right? The human, if you played a human, all of your modifiers in the early stage were 0, right? Your advantages did not exist. Also, though, your disadvantages did not exist. So that is being expunged in subsequent editions, right, in the formal literature. But it's also being worked out in gaming groups themselves. And this is, I think, what's really important for playing as a practice of nurture of your relationships with the people at the table is, as long as playing these games is an attempt to exercise some strongman fantasy, we're not actually going to understand the game. We're not actually going to understand the spiritual growth. We're not actually going to live into a better relationship with each other. And just quite frankly, the freedom and the creativity that are at the core of this game have no room for biological essentialism. It actually doesn't work metaphysically. And that's been admitted. So I think one of the things that's really important then is with storytelling, taking other gaming communities' stories seriously. Listening to other gaming communities and learning from other gaming communities and how they tell their stories. And like, y'all, high fantasy, Nick and I've talked about this with the Rings of Power stuff. High fantasy fandoms, right, have real toxic elements, but high fantasy fandoms also have really cool, creative, integrative spaces. And when we read the stories and take the stories seriously and try to learn from them, it can expand us in really, I think, inclusive and creative ways. But we have to do that with that attention to nurture. And we have to do that with that priority for life affirmation. Yeah.
Cool.
So I really haven't played a lot of D&D, so mine's more of like a general role-playing game kind of stuff. I played some like post-apocalyptic Doctor Who champions, some of those. Whenever I get into these kind of games, one of the things that I like to be is like the most opposite me that I can be. So I tend to be like chaotic, evil, female. Because
That's
I'm
not
a
you,
cis.
Joshua.
That's a
That's not-
solid
I'm like
brag,
a cis,
by the way.
mostly straight.
The opposite of you is chaotic
flex,
evil.
bro.
And I like to be real ugly,
I'm like
weak.
more vanilla than vanilla.
Yeah.
I memorize rules so I make sure I don't accidentally maybe bend one, you know? Like I am the most vanilla. So like when I get into this, I'm like, I want to be chaotic. I want to be like, you know, like just stretch my gender, stretch all the bounds I can, which usually ends up, I'm getting to her, I promise. Usually ends up with like, because we're talking a lot about this, like the collaborative effort of these games, like what it means to like play together. And I'm like, well, I'm playing this character, and what my character would do as chaotic evil is, if you're going to pick up that treasure, I'm going to shoot my teammate in the back and take it from him, because fuck him, you know? Like, yeah. So how does like playing characters that necessarily aren't very collaborative in these collaborative games really, how does that play a part in these conversations?
Did we go for that? You want?
So I can, I have this conversation with my players. So I am currently running a campaign in Pathfinder with several evil characters, and it's been a very interesting exercise. And I think
Interesting exercise.
yes,
There you go. I love that.
no, like it being a story, because in the like actions we're taking, there is an extent to which like you are doing things, but ultimately you are creating a story that we're all witnessing, and like there are good stories about bad people doing stuff and the consequences being something we learn from, or like we learn about ourselves, we learn about the world as we see the consequences of these stories. So like my players were in this city and there was a problem that they had, and there was if you're into Pathfinder lore, they decided to go recruit the Hell Knights, which are a fundamentalist evil group about they're kind of Nazis, not really, but they're like, we're going to go find the strong, we're going to help, and we're going to get their help. And so these are real powerful people, so they went and found them and they got the help. And then basically the way that we kind of dealt with the consequences of that was, next time they were back in town, the Hell Knights had gotten super popular and they had seen the Hell Knight captain that helped them up on a stage giving a speech about how these are the heroes that helped us root out savagery from this city. And we all need to be wary because savagery is in each one of us. It is next to you. It is in our walls. And basically that town's getting real bad. And so, the players were into, like, the characters were into it, but the players are witnessing it and feeling weird about it. And so, it's a way to, let's push on this system in this way and witness what happens. And so I think for the dungeon master and for the player, just observing what happens well is how you make that fun, right? Because if you just let the players indulge in the power fantasy, you're just kind of doing a feedback loop on the worst part of yourselves. But if you're narrating it well, you see the cost. And if everybody is, if your table's mature about it, that can be life-giving in its own way, in that, like, wow, yeah, that real dark thing happened, and it made you think about, like, why did I want to do that? And like, it can be informative and thought-provoking.
Yeah, so I think we can get really myopic in our everyday routines, right? Like, we're just real comfortable in what we're in right now in life. And so role-play gaming like this gives us a chance to cross boundaries that we may or may not actually get to cross in our day-to-day life. And Mary Elizabeth Moore is a brilliant process theologian, super compassionate religious educator. Mary Elizabeth Moore wrote that boundary crossing like this in our storytelling, like when we in gaming like this, when we are able to lean into the storytelling to such an extent that we are comfortable crossing boundaries in the game that we might not actually be able to cross in our daily lives, that this kind of boundary crossing nurtures empathy toward others and raises important existential questions in encounters with similarity and difference. It does not matter if the boundary you crossed is cutting off your teammate's head or not, right? The fact that you had the space to cross that boundary and to actually live into the character and have to process the feelings and emotions and choices to do that is a practice of empathy that can shape your everyday life for a better sense of understanding. This is the beauty of fiction writing, right?
I can't wait to perceive with my arrow.
I'm perceiving these boundaries.
I'm perceiving these boundaries. Nick is going to ask the next question. Nick was our DM for the pregame for the Toga and ruled it, and it was so much fun. And so, yeah, I can't wait to hear what your conversation is, because you had to like man it and deal with us in that party and campaign.
Well, I'm probably a little too loose. Like I'm kind of on the opposite, where I'm like, the rule, like, what do you? Yeah, that's fine. So I like narrative and like to give controls to the players, probably to a fault. But anyway, so my question is actually related to multi-religious belonging, and so how D&D, like even in the world itself, has that, and then of course even with how your dad was doing pedagogy is very multi-religious in the sense because he wasn't using traditional Methodist Christian education, he's using D&D, which is crazy. Not crazy, and it's just awesome. It's fantastic. And
Absolutely.
So I, especially as a Tolkien person, who all of us are many of us have experienced trauma, are very skeptical of the church, but also want to be here, and we find community in D&D or Tolkien, and I have probably had mystical religious experiences. I know I have while I've read Tolkien's Legendarium, and even in D&D sessions while I've DM'd or just participated as a player. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on just like how maybe your own experiences from multi-religious experience in whatever role-playing games you've played, and maybe even if you see that as important, or even just whatever that is, like what does that mean for the future of theology in our lives generally, and also your own experience, how that's been like a comfort for y'all?
Real quick, I'll just say, like, we have like, let's see, 10 minutes. We have 2 more questions I want to get to, so we'll go quick. But I'll just say, like, I am just like a story junkie. And so anywhere you can get like a cool story that can be immersive, that it can expand my imagination and be into, then I'm a part of it. So like the collaborative storytelling part of it with others, being entangled in a party, moving forward an adventure, I'm all for it. So I think healthy communities, faith communities, even churches understand that they're part of a collaborative, entangled storytelling adventure together is what brings hope and energy and zest to a community. So that's where I want to encourage and be a part of and try to like facilitate and spread the good news of. I'm a story junkie, and let's do it. That kind of thing.
Whitehead in Religion in the Making, Alfred North Whitehead says religion is what one does with his solitariness. And that gets misread all the time as the most hyper-individualistic definition of religion that's ever been written in the English language. Instead, knowing Whitehead, knowing process metaphysics and the breadth of how Whitehead thought about the individual and solitariness, to say that religion is what one does with their solitariness is to say religion is what you do when you, as you, realize that you are only you because of all of the relationships that knit the cosmos together. Religion, then, is what you do with the fact that you are you because of your relationships. Multi-religious belonging, I think, and role-playing gaming in this way can really help us think through the doing of that storytelling and play and taking stock of how our relationships constitute all of us, how our relationships contribute to who we understand ourselves to be, but also how we, because of our relationships, contribute to who other people actually are, right? Like, you realize all of us are becoming new people right now because we have been in this conversation, right? How we incorporate that into our own story of ourselves may or may not incorporate the 9 traditional loci of Christian theology. It may, in fact, bring in the case of my dad, it may, in fact, bring in a radically open, monotheistic, unnamed, apophatic cosmology in which there was an unnamed God, and the unnamed God was the deity of the cosmos, and the unnamed God, like the one recognized in Acts, the apostles, the unnamed God was journeying along with the adventurers into an unknown future, right? That storytelling can stick in your craw the exact same way as the best Bonhoeffer Christology you got. If it helps us make sense of how each one of us contribute to who I understand myself to be. So I think role-playing gaming and storytelling really helps broaden our opportunities to account for all of our relationships and to account for who we're responsible to, who we can be grateful to, who we can thank, because without you, I couldn't be me.
Wow.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Nathan. I'm a middle school teacher, and also I DM my middle school kids sometimes. Like
Wonderful.
have D&D club.
What do you teach? What do you
it's the
teach?
coolest thing. I teach history.
He teaches Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, that's what I really try to teach. So I'm coming at it from a few angles. I also gave a talk not to my middle schoolers a few months ago called David Bowie versus the Puritans. And what I found when I was researching for it is an answer, I think, to the question that was earlier about what did the satanic
panic.
The satanic panic, what were they really? And I totally agree with your power thing, but I think, and this is underneath a lot of it, is a real fear of the same reason that they didn't like David Bowie, or like 16th century British plays, which is where the Puritans originally lashed out against, because of the sense of play that they brought. Because they fundamentally don't understand the image of God, and they think all of it is just. They think if your salvation is at risk every moment, you don't have time to play. You don't have time to risk. You don't have time to. So all that together, to the quote that I thought was really cool that I found in doing it was from W.H. Auden in The Age of Anxiety play, where he says, human beings are necessarily actors who cannot become something before they have first pretended to be it. And they can be divided not into the hypocritical and the sincere, but into the sane who know that they are acting and the mad who know that they are not.
Yes.
So that gave me a lot of because I also changed jobs to go to a more religious school. And anyway, that gave me a lot of the reason to carry the D&D thing on. And so I just there's one question that I have, because I also teach, so the big question is this that I want you to answer. Do you have resources to help do what you're talking about to help DMs do this more effectively? So side note, I also teach, I've also always taught it's called roadmap. It's like a roadmap course to help kids figure out, it's what guidance counselors should do, but never get around to. And they just try to, and the whole goal is to help a kid figure out how they're wired up. And my whole goal is and then you figure out how God dealt you the cards and then go with your best version of that. That's what you do, right? And so for that, I always kind of found, I'd never heard the term before, the biological essentialism actually sort of helpful for a lot of kids. Because middle school is the classic place where you get the kid that they're still convinced half my boys are going to be NBA and NFL players. And I'm like, okay, maybe, but let's just think about these other.
Be the greatest middle school football team ever assembled.
Let's consider some of these stats. Let's consider some of your stats. Let's consider what the hand that you've been done. So anyway, I just wondered. I really want to know the resources, but I also wonder your thoughts on that, because I think there's a good part of accepting sort of how you've been wired up that can actually, because otherwise I found sometimes this is not related, but in your DM games, you get a bunch of middle school kids together. Everybody wants to be a dragonborn or a tiefling.
Okay.
Right. They all just want to be I'm stat master of everything.
Right. So to answer the second one, because the first one, I'm happy to share my bibliography with you. But
yeah, that's good.
A lot of it actually comes out of just pedagogy stuff, content gamification pedagogy, and Antonio Ruiz Esquero and education theory people. But to answer the second one, I think one of the things and how I think about boundaries and limitations is helpful here. The difference between biological essentialism and just factual boundaries of the cosmos is that it's just a factual boundary that 99% of your middle school football players are not going to play in the NFL, right? That actually has nothing to do with claims about their value or potential or fixedness as who they are as a living biotic creature, right? And so the narratives that we can share that do give some kind of stability and nurture the creativity from the stability are what are so important. It's when we take what we think is essential to us. The racial essentialism is the most common one here. Nose size, ear size, skin color. When we take these things and say that because of these particular biological traits, therefore the relational capacity is only ever XYZ. That is, instead of nurturing movement toward life and right relationship, that's shutting off possibilities before they're even available. to the kid. So I think there's real value in stability. There's real value in stable narratives, but those stable narratives have to be engaged with intentional nurture for the student for the person as a co-creative partner of the cosmos with God.
And if I can just add a little bit, you talked about stable narratives, and I think this is the value, this is the fun part of role playing as a communal storytelling activity, because for as long as we've been telling each other stories as a species, the go-to way to make a new story was to take a story everyone knows and then change something. And the thing you changed is the point you're making. That is the new story. Yeah. So you can tell us, you can play as an orc who is stronger, and, like we know the story of the orc that is stronger and dumber and scarier. There's not value really to telling that story completely straightforward. Telling that story completely straightforward is what the worst people on the internet want to happen, because they like these really stable biological narratives. Dungeons and Dragons, the way it works is I know people who are like higher minded about wanting to improvise cool stories sometimes don't like how basic some of these stories are. They don't like that Curse of Strahd is just Dracula, but there is value to we're starting from just Dracula. And then everyone in here in this party is going to do something a little different to Dracula, and that's going to make us think. And so that's where the biological imperatives at the beginning of Dungeons and Dragons, they're baked in. And even if you call them ancestries instead of races, they're still baked in. You can move your +2 somewhere else, but it's still, we all know what's going on here. But I think that's like you said, engage with it intentionally. Don't let them tell a story about themselves, about how they're destined to only be one thing. Let them change one thing and feel pushing against the narratives we know how to do. And that, like, role playing is easier when you start from that, because improv is hard. Yes, and so it's valuable to start from, we're doing Dracula, you are an orc, you are a half orc. So you kind of know what's going to happen if you don't change anything. And then that lets you swoop in and change something, and now you've told a story. Now you've learned something about yourself. Now you've thought critically about this thing we're doing.
Great final word. I think there's no more to say other than there's ways to find us to keep this conversation going. We've talked for like an hour and 10 minutes, and we could probably go another 2 hours. But that's what's fun about Beer Camp. You hear these things, something resonates with you, a question rises to the surface, and you meditate on it, you reflect on it. Reach out to us on the internet or DM us, find us, and we'll be happy to keep the conversation going. Thank you all for being here and being a part of our story, and we'll keep adventuring together moving forward. Thanks, y'all. Peace. Come up.
Hi, my name is TJ Blackwell, also known as Tejas, Tiberius Wan, Tejas Jackson, Kung Fu Dugong recently. I go by many, many names, and I came here today to ask you to please check out our YouTube channel. There are a bunch of exclusive series there, like Comic Book Ketchup, Manga Mustard, Drinks with Tejas, which is my personal favorite, the one where I get to talk to other people about their favorite drinks or just drinks in general. We have a companion series to our annual theme on YouTube. We do Friday Night Frights, Wednesday Night Weeaboo. Those are both ran by Christian Ashley. He's great. Check him out. There are exclusive shorts, which are pretty new. Christian reviews. He's going to review every Spider-Man comic one at a time, which is insane. Non-canon, which is where Joshua will be reviewing one IP from outside of canon in his favorite fandoms, or a piece of literature that is part of the biblical extra canonical material, which is a super interesting short series. Will's Wednesday pull list, where he talks about his comic book pull list each week. He picks a top comic for his weeklies. And there are other surprise bonus content. It goes straight to YouTube. And many of our regular podcast episodes get posted there as well, because, we like to see each other when we talk, and we don't want to rob you of that ability. So check us out, like, subscribe. We would appreciate it so much, and it helps us a ton. Thank you.
Be sure to check out other Anazal Ministry Podcast AMP Network shows. You can see the whole network in a single feed if you're on Spotify, or you could go to Apple Podcasts and find the Anazal Ministries Network podcast, the AMP Network. Yeah, there's just a network on Apple. You can follow the whole thing. You'll get shows like The Homily, where Pastor Will goes through his homily messages. It's literally just Pastor Will's sermons, guys. It's great. You also get access to the Whole Church podcast, where TJ and myself interview leaders from across different denominations and backgrounds to work towards a more full church unity. You can see My Seminary Life, where Brandon Knight discusses his experiences at seminary and then discusses seminary topics, so anyone can have access to knowledge available to seminary students. You also can see Let Nothing Move You over there, where Christian Ashley goes through the Bible in a Bible study type fashion and explains the whole biblical narrative. I also have a show on there, The Dummy for Theology, where we discuss various theological topics in an attempt to show every side of the discussions, leaving you with more questions than answers. There's also The Bible After Hours, where the foul-mouthed preacher goes through the Bible from a more progressive view to challenge the status quo of the modern church. Finally, you can hear The Clydes, where Taylor and Elizabeth Clyde go through weekly discussions in a devotional conversational style method to help us all get closer to one another and to God.